Hey guys, and welcome to the show. Today we've got a lot of fun products to go over that we've released since the last show. The most notable, of course, being a new series of Yellow Jacket gear motors, these with a much longer output shaft. We've also got a new inner diameter of shim to talk about and some cool use cases to cover there as well. So I'm really excited to look at all of these products and show you guys some use cases where we think that they are really cool and they can be really useful. So let's take a look at our giveaway. That's what we'll talk about. We're going to be giving away a 5204 80020019, or the 19.2 to 1 ratio. It'd be this guy right here, of the new 5204 gear motors. If you are hoping to win, you'll want to go into the chat and type the keyword for today, which is long, and make sure you're following the stream, or following the channel, excuse me, for your chance to win. If you do win, of course, as always, shoot us an email over to marketing@gobuilda.com and let us know your shipping address and all of that good stuff. We'll get that sent over your way. So with that, we're going to jump right into kind of talk a little bit of motor talk, and then we'll run over to shims in a little while. So of course, this is a very, very similar gear motor to what you guys are used to, which is the 5203s. The gearbox, the gears, all of those internals that we've really liked and developed over the last while are the same. The only difference being the length of the output shaft. This time, instead of a 23.5 millimeter output shaft like you see on a 5203, you see a 79.5 millimeter output shaft, which is really nice, especially for the primary the thing determining that length is driving a hyperhub through channel. So in this case, we see a 5204 direct driving a mecanum wheel. That mecanum wheel, of course, being on the other side of the channel, which is really very simple. Saves you a coupler in a lot of use cases, and it would also let you run some power transmission in this channel really easily. So a great example would be pulleys and chain and stuff like that. You may notice I said 79.5 instead of 80, and that is because 80 millimeters in some use cases can be just a little bit too long, especially when running a bevel or miter gear setup. The same reason that a 5203 is 23.5 millimeters long, it makes it just shy of an 8 millimeter Rex if the motor is running in channel. Kind of a niche use case, but good to have that clearance in the event that you do end up needing it. Like I mentioned before, these have all the same ratios besides the 1-to-1 as the 5203s, and the internals are the same. So they are really beefy gears. I talked a lot about it in the 5204's show, but definitely a very, very solid gearbox for a lot of applications, especially for FTC. These really were designed to be way overkill for us to use on non-FTC projects and kind of sideline and use for FTC because they are so overkill. Now, we did also release another product since the last show, which is a 14 millimeter ID shim. They are really small. You probably won't even be able to see them, but they are a 14 millimeter ID, 15.6 millimeter OD shim, and they are a 1/2 mil thick. These are primarily used for spacing off bearings. So if you need a bearing flange to be further off of a 14 mil bore, this is where you grab these. Most of the time, you're going to stack 3, getting you 1.5 millimeters of total space, and you would use that if you wanted the inside of a 14 mil ID flanged ball bearing to be flush with the inside of channel. It of course does poke the flange out much further, but there are lots of use cases where you want to make sure that is shy of the channel wall, and this is a really nice way to do it. Like I mentioned, you want to use 3 of these 1/2 mil shims, and there are some applications, I'm sure, where you'd want to use just 1 or 2. They can, of course, also be really useful when using 14 millimeter OD tubing in assemblies where you want to use that as a shaft setup they can be very, very nice. They are a little bit more of a niche product, but when you need one, they are super handy. I know I've used them a couple times since we got them in and been really happy with them. We'll kind of jump back into our main topic for today. Don't get me wrong, I'm really excited about the shims, but they are not nearly as exciting as a new series of motors. These were really not designed to replace 5202s or 5203s, more as a supplemental way and a new way to use motors where you wouldn't before. Of course, the big thing to talk about, and I know I've seen a lot of people talk about online, is direct driving drivetrains, which within the FTC space has been a point of contention for longer than I've been around FTC. Direct driving drivetrain wheels can be pretty controversial. We are definitely on the stance that it's perfectly fine, especially with 8mm X output gear motors. There really is no harm in doing it, and depending on how you look at it, you could even say that it makes your drivetrains more efficient. I'm not gonna get into that whole thing today, but it does sometimes make a really simple drivetrain really compact and easy. Here's a great example of a 6-wheel drive with all 6 wheels powered. All 3 wheels per side powered, we'll say that, off of a motor. So this uses those 5204 80mm output motors, directly drives the center wheel, and drives the 2 outer wheels with these sets of belts. Now this is a really simple drivetrain. If you wanted to make it 4-wheel drive, one option, 4-motor drive, one option would be to add another motor to one of your outside wheels. That would be crazy easy, and it wouldn't change your assembly really at all, besides dropping out one bearing and dropping out one of your 2106 shafts. And there are lots of other ways to do it. If you wanted to, say, add a 1-to-1 ratio gear over here, you could do that to add another gear in that system, or add another belt run. If you wanted your center motor to be closer to the center of your chassis. So there are lots of ways to do 4-motor drivetrains, but especially for 2-motor drivetrains, 5204s make it just really, really easy, and they do make it quick and can oftentimes make assemblies fairly reasonable, especially in price. Now, what I expect to see becoming more popular with, say, belt drive mechanisms is direct driving the back wheel. I think that's perfectly a viable way to go with, say, a belt drive up to the front wheel and stuff like that. I think that is a perfectly fine way to do it. Another thing that I know a lot of people talk about a lot on the online forums is supporting the output shaft of gear motors. Since Planetary gear motors almost all the time have 2 bearings on the output shaft, you could see adding a 3rd bearing as over-constraining that shaft. In this use case especially, I don't believe that's a concern really, because of the length of shaft, and you can get definitely some flex out of 1120 U-channel in an application like this, and that bearing can definitely be used as a really nice, meaningful point of support on the shaft. So if you're doing a direct drive setup like this, where you have a gear or a wheel or something on the end of this shaft, adding a bearing here, especially an 8-Rex ID bearing, it can be really nice and can make it a stronger system overall, kind of reduce the chances of bending the shaft. To circle back, I noticed I did say bending the shaft. I really don't believe there's a concern with breaking gearboxes with direct drive setup. It is probably a more direct method of contacting the ground, so you could potentially get some more shock load, but I think especially on these gearboxes, you would be just fine. We'll get that all tightened up. And a really nice thing about this style of drivetrain is that it is really, really smooth. So there are lots of really cool ways you can use it, and they are a really nice, very clean method of power transmission through channel. Another great way to use them is worm gear assemblies, where before you may want to add another piece of shafting, you may just want to grab a 5204 and use that on your driven gear instead. driving gear instead. Excuse me. One thing that I know I have talked to some teams about already is cutting the output shaft, because that is something you may want to look at on a 5204. So because they're 80 mil long, they are a fairly substantial length, and in some applications you may want something in between 24 and 80 millimeters. In those cases, you may want to look at cutting them. A great option is a Dremel or another rotary tool with a cutoff wheel. That would make quick work of shafts like this, and would make, I would venture to guess that cleanup with a file and something like that would be really quick and easy with a rotary tool like that. And some patience. You of course don't want to run at it really quick, but I think that's a really, really nice way to do it. You could also use a hacksaw and a metal cutting blade. I think that would be a fine way to go about it too. For those of you who joined after the start of the show, I know there are a few of you, we are giving away one of these gear motors, the 19.2 to 1. Looks like my bot just jumped in the chat and reminded you too. The keyword is long, so make sure you're following and jump in there, add that to the chat, and be ready to go. If you guys have any questions about these, of course, always feel free to ask us in the chat. If you tag GoBuildTV, then I'll be sure I see it, and we can kind of go from there with that setup. One of the things I'm sure some of you guys may have noticed that we've added to the site fairly recently is gear ratio fractions or calculations, which we added to the site with the hope that you may be able to use them to make your, especially encoder-based autonomouses and calculations, a little bit more precise. In the past, we've used several degrees of rounding on our gearbox reductions. On a part number, say, it might be rounded to the whole number, and inside of a product page you may see that rounded to 1 decimal place, where in reality the two gear ratios that our gearboxes are all based around are not integer values. They are go on forever. So we included the division, the exact math we would use to derive the exact gear ratio on our product page, along with the exact gear ratio math we would use to derive the encoder value. So if you were to say, hey, I want to go this much distance, because I know my diameter of my wheel is this, and I know my gear ratio is this, you can get very, very precise with that gear ratio in your code now, and you could derive it out as long as you wanted. If you're trying to drive a 50-foot long linear slide, it might be worth going out to a really, really long number to make sure you have the correct encoder value in that code. And that kind of brings up an interesting point too, is that since these planetary gear motors are all based around 2 stages, there are lots of different parts and lots of different gears used in these, but they all boil down to a combination of 2 different gear ratios, which are 5.2 to 1 and 3.7 to 1. And roughly, of course. And these 2 gear ratios are used to create all of the ratios you see here, just by changing which stages you use and how many of them you have. A great example is a 19.2 to 1 gear motor. It's going to have one 5.2 to 1 stage and one 3.7 to 1 stage. Say a 14 to 1 or 13.7 is going to use 2 3.7 stages, and a 26.9 is going to use 2 5.2 to 1 stages. So there are a lot of different ratios you can get by just changing around, swapping around 2 different sets of gear ratios in that. I'm sure you can just visually see we have 4 different numbers of stages in gearboxes. We have a 4-stage, a 3-stage, a 2-stage, and a single stage. And all of these can kind of serve different use cases, of course, by increasing the ratio, decreasing the speed, and that also will increase the length. If you're comparing them to, say, a 5202 gear motor, you'll notice that the longer lengths of 5203s and 5204s are substantially longer, where the single stage and 2-stage are very comparable or shorter than a 5202. That is because we definitely worked to shorten the first and last sections of the gearbox, the adapter plate and the output housing, while really increasing the gear thickness inside of the gearbox. So they are a few mil taller. Each stage is a few mil taller than a 5202, which means as you stack up more and more stages, you add more and more thickness to the gearbox, which can be really exciting for a lot of things, especially durability. I'm sure you'll also notice that they're a larger diameter, so larger mod gears, and that of course also helps durability. They're all steel, which is something I know we've seen some teams struggle with 5202s. So all those benefits that you know and really love from the 5203s, you find on 5204s as well. It's kind of a story of the same old dog with some new tricks, namely an 80mm long output shaft for a lot of these direct drive and applications similar to that. Let's see here. Definitely let us know if you guys have any questions. I think a big thing that helped me a lot when looking at these gearboxes and kind of preparing for this show was looking at the product insights we have on the pages. They do go into a lot of really cool use cases and really show off the advantages and the strengths of these gearboxes in exact part lists and everything going through there. So looks like, let's see here, looks like we've got most of you guys in this giveaway. Yep, so we'll go ahead and roll for our giveaway, I think. I think that seems like it would be a good time for that. So we'll go ahead and close that giveaway and roll for our winner. Oh man, it looks like Yarat. I'm gonna go with that. Looks like you're our winner of our 5204 gear motor, 5204 series gear motor. If you would like to, you can absolutely shoot us an email to marketing@gobuilda.com. Let them know, hey, I want a 19.2:1 5204 gear motor. Here's my shipping info, my team number, and all that good stuff. And we will get you your motor sent out to you. Let's see here. With that, I think that's about the primary things we have for you today. Looks like I got a question in the chat. Have you ever done shock load testing with direct drive configurations? We definitely have run around a lot of direct drive chassis around here, and we haven't ever had any issues. And we've talked to a lot of teams who have run direct drive motors. I think the big concern that you may run into is potentially dropping your robot and bending the output shaft of the motor. And that is more of a pain than replacing a single 8mm X shaft, stuff like that. So that is the downside, is if your pit tables collapse at Houston Worlds and your robot falls on the ground from 5 feet, it may bend the shaft. And that is more of a pain to replace than a stock shaft you may have extras of a little more easily. But overall, as far as the gearbox is concerned, we really have put these gearboxes through way more than you would ever see in FTC in direct drive setups, and they are just fine. They are really beefy. I may be a little more concerned about a planetary gearbox with a smaller gear in it, or a plastic gear, but especially with these, they are just fine. I really think that overall they probably that direct drive does probably allow some more slippage, and probably would be a little easier on the shaft than something like a miter gear, which may have some backlash and may have some aggressive, sharp hits. Dan's Van 805, Ethan, have you seen what FTC students are like? I'm not concerned about the robots, I'm concerned about the students. I can see that too. If you were dropping your robot all the time, you definitely could bend output shafts. A great potential solution would be a parallel plate style chassis where you have another point of support on the outside of your wheel, or your second point of support of the motor shaft is on the outside of the wheel. That's a really cool thing that I'm excited to see some CAD of, I'm sure, and some builds of, as you guys start working with these motors and stuff like that. I do think it is really a fun topic to talk about, direct drive versus not. But I think the big thing that not direct drive buys you is being able to place your motors wherever within your chassis. I know we do it inside the frame rail and the strafer. You may want to put them all the way to the back, or centered, or all the way to the front in a chassis with belt drive or chain drive, stuff like that. So that does give you a really nice level of flexibility within your setup. And kind of as always, I never think it's a bad idea to have a backup motor or two, especially on your chassis. I know I personally have run into that at competitions that I've competed at, where I didn't show up with a backup motor and something happened and that motor wasn't operable anymore. So I think that is always a good idea. If that failure mode is dropping your robot because the pit table collapsed, that is the failure mode, but that's always a good idea when competition is the name of the game, especially like it is in FTC. Tipped over inspection tables, I guess, are also a possibility there. So with that, I definitely thank you guys so much for tuning in. I'm really excited to see what you do with these 5204 series gear motors in Discord and in competitions as we start getting back to be able to go to competitions, especially next FTC season. If you want to see us at an event, shoot us an email to marketing@gobuildit.com and we'll see what we can do for you and maybe even be able to come there. With that, thank you guys so much, and we'll see you next time.